This is Linda Snetselaar. I'm editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And today we are doing a podcast on the changing face of school food service during a pandemic. Very important topic in our changing world today. We're pleased today to have with us Dr. Marlene Schwartz. She is the director of the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity and professor of human development and family science at the University of Connecticut. She's a clinical psychologist and she received her PhD from Yale University and has worked as a therapist treating eating disorders and obesity. She designs research studies that inform the policy that can improve the food environment, specifically for children and low-income families. Currently, her research focuses on school wellness policies and improving the nutrient quality of food in the food bank system. Very, very important area. I am going to begin by saying welcome, Dr. Schwartz.
Great. Thanks for having me.
My first question is certainly related to the pandemic. Wondered if you would tell us what happened to school meals last March when school buildings closed due to COVID-19.
Sure. So I think last March is probably a month that food service professionals are going to remember forever because everything changed and it changed really quickly. So I can speak for what happened here in Connecticut. You know, we had our first positive COVID case on March 8th. And by March 13th, the Department of Education had already gotten its waiver to allow districts to continue distributing meals. By March 15th, our governor issued an executive order saying that school buildings had to close. Initially, we thought it would be for 2 weeks, but it became clear after a little bit longer that it was going to be much longer than that. And what's amazing is by Monday, March 16th, 64 school districts had already started their emergency meal programs. And over the rest of the month, many other districts joined that. So in the end, when you looked at it, about 71% of Connecticut school districts continued to provide meals to students during the emergency closure. So I think it's fascinating because it required sort of a tremendous pivot in terms of how pretty much everything is done in a school meal program. And the waivers came in, so you didn't have to worry about congregate meals. You could do grab and go meals. There were waivers that allowed you to give the food to parents without the child being there. And then eventually some districts got waivers that allowed them to give any adult the meals if for all the children under age 18, whether they were in that school district or not. So we really saw sort of a tremendous amount of flexibility because everyone had the big picture in mind that what was most important was getting the meals to the children.
So what did you see as some of the challenges during this time?
So there were a lot of challenges. One of the things that people had to figure out first was how were they going to get the meals to the families. I would say the most common was sort of a grab and go system where they would set up tables or tents outside schools where they would have the food and people would drive up and either someone would come get it, the parent would come get it, or someone actually put the food in the car. Then other districts, though, particularly some of our more rural districts, decided to continue paying the school bus drivers and have them deliver, almost do like a reverse pickup. Instead of picking up the child, they were dropping off the meals. And so they would do their regular route, drop off the meals. And some challenges with that is you needed to make sure that someone was there to get the meal on the other end. And I think that as they got used to it, they were able to really let families know exactly what time to come out and get the meal. Another thing that was challenging was figuring out the timing of everything. So a lot of these districts, pretty much everybody was serving lunch and many were serving breakfast as well. And typically you have to do that as two separate things, but it became clear that that wasn't very efficient. So they started bundling, sort of serving, both breakfast and lunch at the same time, 5 days a week. And I'd say about half of the districts did that. And the other half started consolidating. So they would either be open Tuesdays and Thursdays or Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then they would serve enough meals to sort of get through to the next distribution day. So those were all challenges. Another one was that many staff members, understandably, were very concerned. Either they were concerned about for their own health. We were having a pandemic and there were a lot of, rules in terms of social distancing. And so they were worried about getting sick. And another thing is everybody's kids were home from school. So if someone who works in the, in a food service program has young children, somebody had to watch their kids as well. So I think that was a big challenge. And we heard districts dealt with that sometimes by having other professionals from the school come in. So we heard of a district that had the school nurses come and they helped out. Another one had paraprofessionals. We heard a lot about custodial staff coming because you really needed, to sort of keep the environment clean. And also there was a lot of carrying, a lot of heavy things. And so I think it was important to have, additional staff members there to help with that. So those were just a bunch of the challenges that we heard about.
I know too that along with those challenges, there may have been innovations as well. And I wondered if you could describe some of the innovations that occurred at this particular point in time.
Sure. So this was the inspiring part of doing this study, and I probably should have mentioned before, we did do a study this summer where we called 9 different food service directors around the state of Connecticut, kind of a diverse sample of districts, and spent about an hour talking to them about what happened in March and, the very same questions you're asking me now. So that's when I say that's what we heard, that's what I'm referring to. Some of the innovations had to do with just the sort of practical question of what were they serving. So I think in the beginning, especially when we thought it was only for 2 weeks, a lot of districts kind of went to cold meals, sandwiches, salads, things like that, and thought that would be the easiest. But it became clear as time went on that they wanted to be able to serve, especially the familiar meals. We actually heard one district said, Friday's pizza day. We wanted to provide pizza on Friday. So districts started figuring out ways to package the meals safely, but in a way that they could be warmed up at home. And that took quite a lot of work because they needed to think about if this is going to be microwavable, it had to be in a microwavable container. If it wasn't going to be microwavable, there was a lot of worry that a child might not understand that. So it had to be very clearly labeled how to heat up the food. So I think there was a lot of innovations and things that, that people had never done before, because this isn't normally something that you have to worry about when you're serving school meals. Another thing that was really inspiring that we heard about were communities that started really working together. So, the way that districts are set up in Connecticut, and I'm sure it's true in a lot of states, is it's fairly small. We have, I think, 159 school districts, and we're not a very big state. So individual districts tend to be, a fairly small community. And what was nice was hearing about local restaurants or other organizations in the town that would try to pitch in and help. And so, for example, one district talked about how they were able to provide the meals Monday through Friday, and then a restaurant came in and provided meals for the weekends. We heard a lot of different companies that would donate money or gift cards to the program to try to help offset the cost. And then we heard of some nice collaborations between the food service and the charitable food system. So there are a lot of food pantries around the state, and sometimes those are actually in schools. More often they're not, but we heard examples of where, for example, the food would be getting distributed in the parking lot at the school, and the mobile produce truck that the food bank runs would kind of pull up at the same time, so that families could pick up their meals and then go a very short distance to pick up their additional food. We heard another example where it was similar. You came to get your food and they handed you a piece of paper that drew you a little map. This is how you get to the food pantry if you need additional food beyond this. So those innovations were really inspiring. I think another thing that was interesting is everyone sort of defaulted to thinking the distribution centers should be the school buildings. But in one of the cities, the food service director realized that the school buildings, these buildings were old, and the way the town had sort of grown didn't exactly reflect where the buildings were. And he really felt like the physical location in the town where he felt the families that definitely, would need the free meals were located weren't so close to a building. So he got permission to actually use other government properties in the town and to distribute in those locations sort of strategically placed so they were within walking distance from the neighborhoods where he knew the families were living that he was hoping to serve. We also heard of some districts that tried to combine the grab and go with delivery. So they would have grab and go as their sort of default program, but then they may know of particular families that really couldn't, either didn't have a car or for other reasons weren't able to leave their homes. And so they would arrange delivery specifically for those families. So that was another, I thought, great example of sort of the food service really understanding their community and being able to communicate and meet their needs.
Well, thank you so much. Incredible stories showing communities coming together in the midst of such a devastating event. That's really heartwarming. My last question then relates to lessons learned, and I wondered if you could maybe describe what lessons were learned that may be useful to share with food service directors as they look forward to the fall.
Sure. So one of the lessons learned that I think should be highlighted is that in the beginning, a lot of the food service directors said that the participation wasn't at nearly as high, certainly nearly as high as it was usually, but even as high as they thought it would be. And as they started to inquire what was going on, what they learned were a couple of useful things that I think will be helpful for others to know. Number one, people didn't realize that you could get the meals even if you didn't normally get free meals at school. These meals were available for everyone, including, what we think of as the kids who typically pay for the school lunch. So it's important to communicate that. Number two, it's really important to communicate that you're not going to be requiring identification or proof of immigration status when you show up to pick up your meal. People heard that families were afraid to come because they were worried that potentially their immigration status would be questioned, and they just didn't want to have to deal with that. So it's important to communicate that that's not happening. It's also sort of similarly, I think it's great to be able to communicate about the availability of the meals many different ways. So everyone put it on their website and use sort of the typical school communication strategies. But some of the towns that really wanted to increase participation would put up banners throughout the town in other places, and then would even create a pickup location that had more than just the meal. So we heard about one where they also would have other organizations come, and they called them community information hubs. And so they would provide information about SNAP. They would provide information about how to register to vote, how to enroll for kindergarten, checking out library books. So just really trying to make it more than just the school meal, but more of a place where it's really going to be worth it for the family to make the trip because they can access so many other resources. And then I'd say another thing that would be really helpful if this happens again is if the states, or perhaps the state chapters of the School Nutrition Association, could coordinate purchasing of some of the things that nobody knew they were going to need to buy before. So packaging, we heard a lot about how hard it was to get appropriate packaging for the food. We heard about there was a rush on baby carrots in single-serve packages. That was something that everybody needed to sort of quickly be able to have a vegetable serving to put in, and they were nowhere to be found. And you don't want districts competing with each other, to try to purchase these things. So I think if that could be coordinated more at the state level or regional level, that would be really helpful. And then I even think, there just was a lot of learning on the fly about how to set up the prep stations in an ergonomic manner where, you were standing there, you're having to keep your distance. So we heard about food service directors who would go in and they'd realize that the table needed to be raised higher, or people were going to start having back problems, or they had to swap out lighter pans than the typical pans that they use because now they were carrying them around a lot more. So I'd say the take-home message from that is for the food service director to physically go to the sites and be there and kind of be the eyes and ears to really see what's happening and ask your staff, how's it going? What's hard for you right now? What do you think would make it easier? This is really a time to listen to the people that are on the ground because none of us have done this before. And so I think that as they sort of heard about the problems, they could then really collaborate and problem solve. So that's sort of a take-home message. And then the last one I'll mention, and this is an advocacy position I'll take, is that I know that there are a number of national advocacy groups right now that are recommending to the federal government that we have universal free meals this year. And I think this is a really sensible idea because it's going to be so complicated this fall. I think even right now, as we're taping this at the end of July, we don't know what September is going to look like in districts across the country. And it feels like, there's so much to overcome that if we can just take the worry of families getting enough food for their children off that list of things to worry about, it's very much worth it. And so this idea of just having free universal meals this school year means that, number one, we're recognizing the fact that food insecurity has gone up significantly since the pandemic began. We know how many Americans have lost their jobs. And so if we can just make that decision as a country that this is a priority and that we're going to provide these meals, I feel like the food service, groups around the country would step up and make sure that they were able to provide those meals. Financially, it's really difficult for them because most of the food service groups actually rely on a la carte sales, which are, sort of cash. They rely on other sorts of income, sort of revenue generators like catering or selling to staff. That's all gone. So this is really only the reimbursable school meal. So we just can't have a situation where they are trying to continue providing these meals and losing so much money. They can't do offer versus serve in this scenario. They need to put the entire food package together. So that's an additional cost, not to mention the packaging. So I guess if there's a take-home message for people listening is, I think we all should be advocating for this because I really do think it's the right thing to do for the students in the country.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so very much. What an important point to end on. I also wanted to indicate that I think the kind of qualitative research that you've done here is quite a beautiful example of what has the potential to change food policy, but also it shows the kinds of things that we can learn from food service directors and others who are interviewed in this kind of qualitative manner. And so important, I think, to our profession, but also to the kinds of things that you've been talking about. If indeed we're in this situation again and we may not be out of it as quickly as we might like, there were many things that you learned that I think will help us in the future relative to food service policy. So thank you so very much for being willing to be with us today. And we so appreciate your time and the work that you're doing in this area of qualitative research.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.